Hi, my name's Graham Thompson. Cats permitting, I am going to be presenting you with some of Mr. Tatchell's monster whoppers that he has told over the years to cover up for his history of open paedophile advocacy in the 80s, 90s and beyond. I think you could probably make about 2 or 3 feature-length videos if you were going to go into all of his lies. I am just focusing, talking of cats, I am just going to be focusing on one aspect of his lies that stem from part of an interview that Gary Kavanagh of GRIPT did with Mr. Tatchell in 2020 on his contribution to the paedophile anthology Betrayal of Youth, put together by PI Paedophile Information Exchange Vice Chairman Warren Middleton, and published in 1986, as you can see here. Now, as well as publishing the editorialized version of the interview, GRIPT also published the verbatim interview. I believe it was conducted by email, and also Peter Tatchell helpfully published it on his own website. So there's no dispute that Peter Tatchell accepts that these are his words, at least what I will be quoting from him in 2020. And well, just see how this unfolds if you're not acquainted with how things unfolded. Now, before I go in, I'm not going to go into all of that part of the interview. I'm just going to pick out what I think are the most relevant bits. Before I do that, I'm going to read to you an extract from Peter Tatchell's contribution to that paedophile anthology. I featured this in part 1, the paedophile words of Mr. Tatchell. I'm going to give a bit of commentary on it as well. Certainly, in the realm of sexual ages of consent, we need to ask whether the law has any legitimate role to play in criminalizing consenting, victimless sexual activity. As for protecting the young, the main protection they need, as do adults, is legal protection against forced, involuntary sexual acts, which is afforded by the laws covering rape and sexual assault. So, Peter Tatchell is arguing that the laws on sexual consent for adults should also apply to children. He is calling for abolition of the age of consent. Now let's get into parts of that part of his interview with Gary Kavanagh. It's going to be repetitious in places. I hope you'll see why as this goes on. So this is the main part of his explanation to Gary Kavanagh on how he came to be contributing to this anthology. The request to write for the Betrayal of Youth was in about 1981 or 1982. It was made by phone call and I was given an address to post it to. I do not remember who asked me to write the chapter or the address to which I sent it. No mention was made of PI or paedophilia when I was asked to write my chapter. Paedophiles are devious. Why were my eyes just drawn then to the devious smirk on Peter Tatchell's face? Never mind, let us continue. Paedophiles are devious. They knew I would not write for a pie book, so I was told it was a book about child welfare and rights. And Gary Kavanagh goes on to ask, were you aware of who the editor of the book would be before you wrote your piece? I was not aware of the editor of the book. I did not find out who the book's editor was until after the book was published and I was posted a copy. 1986. About 4 or 3 years after I had wrote my chapter, I was horrified and angry. I wanted to complain, but the book had no contact address. When did you become aware that Mr. Middleton was heavily involved with PI, Paedophile Information Exchange? Several years later, when the book was published, I was enraged, appalled, and felt conned. Hard to keep a straight face reading this. When you became aware that you had been misled, did you make any attempt to stop the publication of the book? I did not become aware that I had been misled until after the book was published, when someone sent me a copy in about 1986 or 1987. I had no contact details for the publisher. It was self-published. I was shocked, disgusted, and angry. I was posted a copy with no note about who sent it and no contact details on whom I could complain to. So, I'm guessing that you were struggling to keep a straight face during that as well. I mean, this is about the most serious of matters, but this is the blackest of black comedy, the stories he comes out with. So I'm going to give a little preface of the language that he used to explain what he says he felt about the book and about him having been tricked. He used that word elsewhere in the interview, and how he felt about being tricked into writing for it. Dreadful, nauseating book. I was horrified and angry. I was enraged, appalled, and felt conned. I was shocked, disgusted, and angry. I denounced the book and child sex abuse. I was furious. And last but not least, I have never associated with Warren Middleton. One year after this interview, a glowing review by Peter Tatchell of this book was discovered at the British Public Library. Now, Gary Kavanagh of GRIPT very kindly sent me the photocopy that a colleague of his did of that review. It was published in the Communist Party newspaper 7 Days. And what I am going to do now, I am going to give you a side-by-side comparison of the lies Peter Tatchell told in 2020 and the lies Peter Tatchell told in 2021 to GRIPT and the Telegraph that first broke the story of this glowing review Peter Tatchell had done of a paedophile book that he had claimed hitherto he was conned into writing for. But before I do that, again, I'm going to read again an extract from his review that I read in the Paedophile words of Peter Tatchell, with a bit of commentary as well. Let's get to that. Society would remove a lot of sexual fear, anxiety and guilt if, instead of repressing children's sexuality, it acknowledged the fact that many children have sexual desires at an early age and accordingly educated children so they are able to make free, informed and responsible decisions about when and with whom they have sex. Early age children who can speak. He's talking about children from as young as 3. If you had any doubts about the extract I read from his contribution to Warren Middleton's Paedophile anthology, that he was calling for abolition of the age of consent, you've no need to have any doubts now. Now, let's get in to that side-by-side comparison of the lies he told in 2020 and the lies he told in 2021 after his glowing review of the Paedophile anthology he was tricked into writing was discovered. So on the left, this is from GRIPT in 2021, asking Mr. Tatchell about that review. Tatchell says that ultimately he was too busy to write the review and that a colleague wrote it for him. Tatchell reviewed what his colleague had written, but the piece was much longer than I expected, and as such, Tatchell mistakenly did not take enough time to read the draft properly. And this is what Mr. Tatchell told the Telegraph. On Tuesday night, Mr. Tatchell said that he had still not read the book when he submitted the review, which a colleague had drafted when he submitted the review, adding, "I apologise unreservedly for putting my name to this review and for failing to make clear my unconditional opposition to adults having sex with children." One imagines that when the commissioning editor of the communist publication 7 Days asked Mr. Tatchell to write a review for this paedophile anthology, he was not entirely surprised that what he got back from Mr. Tatchell was his wholehearted support for adults being able to have sex with children as young as 3. Read all of the review, it's in the description. As Mr. Tatchell had, after all, called for abolition of the age of consent in the paedophile anthology he was reviewing. No surprise at all, I am sure. Childhood sexuality, intergenerational sex, and Mr. Tatchell's moniker to that. I did not become aware that I had, we're going back to 2020, I did not become aware that I had been misled until after the book was published, when someone sent me a copy in about 1986 or 1987. And this to the Telegraph in 2021. Mr. Tatchell said last night that he had still not read the book and did not know of its connections to Pi when he was asked by a person I trusted to write a review condemning the censorship of it in 1987. Mr. Tatchell claims that he only learnt of the true contents of the book and Middleton's connections when it was sent to him years later, and he felt tricked and betrayed years later after the review, which is different to what he was saying, that he was sent it in 1986, 1987, after it was published. So clearly, after his glowing review was discovered, he needed to change the lies that he was telling, as clearly this lie was no longer going to work that he'd told in 2020. The true contents of the book were in the review he wrote that he had glowingly endorsed. And a little extract from the review itself. You'll see here, if you can see my mouse, Warren Middleton. Warren Middleton's name, the chap he has never associated with, comes up to us. Let's actually read this extract. When Warren Middleton recently compiled his book on children's sexual rights, to which I made a brief contribution, he found it impossible to get a publisher. They were all too nervous, so he had to publish it himself. Even now, only a few bookshops, notably Gaze the Word in London, a bookshop still doing business, have had the courage to stock it. Indeed, I am only writing this review because it seems that no one else is willing to risk association with this taboo subject. Under Middleton's editorship, The Betrayal of Youth presents a blah blah blah. That does not exactly say this, does it? Moving on. Back to 2020. When did you become aware that Mr. Middleton was heavily involved with Pi? Several years later, when the book was published. Not several years later, after the book was published. And this is GRIPT in 2021 asking about the inconsistencies over Mr. Middleton. However, the review published in 7 days mentions Middleton by name twice. When this was put to Tatchell, he told GRIPT that he had clumsily expressed himself, and that he had meant that he had no knowledge of who Warren Middleton was or what his views were, beyond the fact that he was credited as the editor of the book. Now, you're probably thinking at this point that Peter Tatchell is a really bad liar, but actually, in my opinion, having looked at him pretty closely, I would say that Peter Tatchell is a really, really good liar. It's just that when the facts so directly contradict your lies, even a first-class liar like Peter Tatchell has trouble holding his story together. And lastly, I was posted a copy, going back to 2020, I was posted a copy with no note about it, who sent it, and no contact details on the book to whom I could complain. One might have imagined that when the commissioning editor of 7 Days asked Mr. Tatchell to write a review for the book, that was an ideal opportunity to complain. Peter Tatchell's relationship with the truth is the same as his relationship with children. It is highly perverse. Now, at the same time that this story broke of what Mr. Tatchell said in 2020, not quite tallying with the review he wrote of this paedophile anthology just a year after, there was another story running about Mr. Tatchell, which was the hagiography documentary put together by Elton John and David Furness, conferring sainthood upon Mr. Tatchell for his human rights work. Now, to my knowledge, after the Telegraph, followed up by GRIPT, broke the story on Peter Tatchell's glowing review for a paedophile anthology he had claimed to be tricked into writing for, a review in which Peter Tatchell advocated adults being able to have sex with early age children. Not one news outlet picked up that story. The British media, just about in its entirety, acted as a PR agency for Peter Tatchell's Jimmy Savile Mask of Virtue as a human rights campaigner. Peter Tatchell does not believe in human rights. People who believe in human rights believe in freedom of assembly. Peter Tatchell, to this day, celebrates disrupting church services because the church did not see eye to eye to him on homosexuality. People who believe in human rights do not believe in locking up their opponents. Peter Tatchell is one of the movers and shakers behind the spurious conversion therapy ban that is currently going through Parliament, that if passed in the way he wants it to be, will lock up people who tell groomed children biology is real and give child sex abuse victims who don't want to be homosexual the counselling and prayer they ask for. Peter Tatchell wants child predators to be able to lock up child protectors. And people who believe in human rights are against child mutilation. Peter Tatchell is in favour of mutilating children because if children can consent to change sex, they will be allowed to consent to have sex. I've got a question for you. Have you ever heard just one LGBTQ activist ever protest that an unrepentant paedophile advocate like Peter Tatchell is a frontman for LGBTQ? Have you? Because I certainly haven't. Why could that be? Why could that be? Well, I would suggest that it's obvious, not just with Mr. Tatchell, but plenty else when you look closely at LGBTQ. LGBTQ, genderqueer LGBTQ, is a paedophile front. It is Pi Mark II operating by stealth, and it has had spectacular success. In 2019, Parliament voted by 538 to 21 to make LGBTQ grooming compulsory in school from kindergarten, to avoid being called bigot, homophobe and transphobe by hate-filled genderqueer fanatics. And now, as I have mentioned, there is a spurious conversion therapy ban going through Parliament that, if passed the way they want it to be, will let child predators lock up child protectors. Granny, what big teeth you have. I am going to end this video on Peter Tatchell's paedophile lies, the same way I ended my video on his paedophile words. If Peter Tatchell goes down, LGBTQ goes down. If Peter Tatchell does not go down, the age of consent will be abolished sooner rather than later. What's it going to be?